There is a version of Walter White the show never quite lets you settle on. Not the mild chemistry teacher wiping down a whiteboard for a room of bored teenagers. Not the desperate father doing sums at the kitchen table while the bills pile up. Not the cold man in the pork pie hat who tells a rival to say his name. All three are true at the same time, and the unnerving thing Breaking Bad does is refuse to tell you which one was really there the whole time. Tonight, here on Rock, we are going to sit with that question for a couple of hours. The philosophy of Walter White, the ideas buried underneath the meth and the money and the long empty desert, and what a dying man's 2 short years actually add up to when you lay them out end to end. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and if you have not subscribed yet, it honestly helps us keep making these long, quiet ones. Settle in, we will be here a while. Start where the series starts him, because the man you meet in the first episode is already a philosophical problem walking around in a beige jacket. Walter White is a high school chemistry teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and by every visible measure his life has gone quietly wrong. He is 50 years old, or almost, on the morning the story opens. He teaches bright chemistry to students who do not care, and after the bell he goes to a second job at a car wash, where one of those same students photographs him wiping down the hubcaps of a nicer car than he will ever own. He has a wife, Skyler, a teenage son, Walter Jr., who has cerebral palsy, and a baby on the way that the family had not planned for. The house is small, the water heater is failing, his half of the double income barely covers the shape of an ordinary American life, and even that is held together with tape. Now, none of that is unusual. Half the country lives some version of it. What makes Walt a specific kind of tragedy, rather than just a tired man, is what sits underneath the ordinary disappointment, and Breaking Bad is patient about revealing it. Years before the story starts, Walt co-founded a company called Gray Matter Technologies with his friend Elliot Schwartz and a woman named Gretchen, who Walt was once close to, romantically close, before she married Elliot. Walt was there at the beginning of something that turned into a giant. And then, for reasons the story doles out slowly and never fully lets Walt say out loud without flinching, he sold his share of that company. He walked away for a few $1,000s. By the time we meet him, Gray matter is worth billions, and the piece Walt sold for the price of a used car would, on paper, have made him one of the richest men in the state. That is the wound. The show calls back to it again and again, and Vince Gilligan, the creator, has said in interviews that the real reason Walt left was not money and not any clean disagreement. It was pride. It was ego. It was Walt feeling small and outmatched next to Gretchen's wealthy family, feeling that he did not belong, and choosing to remove himself rather than be the poor relation at a rich table. He left because he could not stand to be less than, and then he spent 20 years watching the thing he built with his own mind make other people fortunes while he corrected multiple choice tests. Read this way, the cancer is almost beside the point. The rot was already there. The cancer just lights it up. I find this the most honest thing the series does in its first hour, and it is the thing casual viewers skip past on the way to the explosions. Breaking Bad is not, underneath, a story about a good man forced into crime by a cruel diagnosis. That is the story Walt tells himself, and it is the story the marketing tells you, and for a while it is genuinely persuasive. But the diagnosis lands on top of a man who has been silently furious for 2 decades. It does not create Heisenberg, it gives him permission. The philosophers have a name for the moment Walt is standing in when the doctor tells him the news, and it is worth pausing on because it is the hinge the whole series swings on. The existentialists, thinkers like Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Sartre, kept circling the idea that we spend most of our lives half asleep to the fact that we are going to die, and that being forced awake to it, really awake, changes everything about how a person weighs their own days. Heidegger called it being toward death, this idea that only when you truly face the end do the questions of what your life is actually for stop being abstract and start being urgent. For most of us, the confrontation never fully comes. We know we will die the way we know a distant country exists. For Walt, it arrives as a specific number. Inoperable lung cancer, stage 3, less than 2 years, and here is the strange part. He has never even been a smoker. The universe hands him a death sentence for a crime he did not commit, roughly the day after his 50th birthday, and something in him that had been clenched for 20 years finally lets go. What Breaking Bad is dramatizing in that first episode is a man discovering, far too late and for the worst possible reasons, that he is free. Not free in a happy way, free in the vertiginous, frightening way the existentialists meant it. Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to be free, that we are always choosing, always authoring ourselves through what we do, and that the comforting idea of a fixed self we are simply obligated to be is a kind of lie we tell to avoid the weight of that freedom. Walt has spent his whole adult life hiding inside the fixed self, the teacher, the provider, the reasonable man who made a reasonable choice and must now live reasonably with it. The diagnosis knocks that structure down, and what he finds standing in the rubble is the terrible realization that he could have been choosing all along, and that a great deal of his suffering was, in some sense, chosen, or at least accepted, out of fear. There is a small moment early on, so small it is easy to miss, where the shape of everything to come is already visible. Walt is teaching, and he tells his students that chemistry is, properly understood, the study of change, growth, decay, transformation. It is the kind of line a good teacher says 100 times without meaning very much by it, but the story means it completely. Walt is about to become the study of change. He is going to grow and decay at the same time, and the horror and the fascination of the next 2 years is that you cannot always tell, in the moment, which of the two is happening. That is the promise the series makes in its opening minutes, and it is why Gilligan described the whole arc with a phrase that has followed the show ever since. He said he wanted to turn Mr. Chips into Scarface. To take the gentle schoolteacher from the old film, the beloved Mr. Chips of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and over the course of the series transform him, deliberately and completely, into Tony Montana, the paranoid drug lord of Scarface, dying in a heap of his own excess. Not a good man broken by circumstance. A good man revealed, or unmade, or, and this is the question the whole show refuses to answer for you, perhaps a man who was never quite what he seemed, becoming at last what he always had the capacity to be. Hold on to that uncertainty, because it turns out the series gave it a name. When Walt sits down across a table from a violent drug distributor named Tuco Salamanca in the first season, a man who has already put another dealer in the hospital in front of him, he does something that, for a mild chemistry teacher, is almost absurd. Tuco asks who he is dealing with. And Walt, who could give any answer, who could stay a nobody and stay a little safer, chooses a name. Heisenberg. He is not asked to have an alter ego. He reaches for one, the way a boy reaches for a costume, and from that moment forward the man in the pork pie hat is a person he is building on purpose. The name is not random, and this is the detail that made a lot of viewers sit up the first time they caught it. Werner Heisenberg was a German physicist, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, and the thing his name is most attached to in the popular mind is the uncertainty principle, first laid out in 1927. Put very plainly, and physicists will forgive the flattening, the uncertainty principle says that for certain pairs of properties of a tiny particle, its position and its momentum, you cannot know both at once with perfect precision. The closer you pin down where a thing is, the blurrier your knowledge of where it is going becomes, and the other way around. The act of measuring changes the thing measured. At the smallest scale, certainty itself has a limit built into the fabric of the world. Now, Walt is a chemist, not a physicist, so Breaking Bad is not saying he lives and breathes quantum mechanics. The name is an illusion, a wink, and it is doing thematic work rather than scientific work. Because what is Walter White across 5 seasons, if not a man you cannot measure without changing? Every character who tries to locate him precisely, to say precisely who this man is and precisely where he is headed, ends up wrong, and often ends up dead for being wrong. Skyler thinks she knows the shape of her husband and spends 2 years revising. Jesse thinks he knows his partner and revises until it nearly kills him. Hank, a trained investigator whose entire job is pinning people down, spends the whole series unable to see the man sitting at his own dinner table. Walt's position and his momentum can never be fixed at the same time. Where he is and where he is going refuse to resolve into one clear picture. The name he chose for himself is, read this way, a confession dressed up as a boast. I am the uncertainty, you will not measure me. I think that is a stunning piece of writing, and what I love about it is that the story never once explains the joke. It trusts you to either catch it or not, and it works completely either way. If you never learn who Werner Heisenberg was, the name still sounds hard and cold and foreign, which is exactly the armor Walt wants. And if you do know, it opens up into this whole second meaning about the impossibility of ever fully knowing a person, even one you have slept beside for the better part of a lifetime. The show hides its thesis inside a costume shop pseudonym, and lets you find it in your own time. There is a deeper idea underneath the alias, and it is one the philosophers have chewed on for a long time. When Walt names himself Heisenberg, he is engaging in an act of self-creation, and self-creation is one of the oldest and most dangerous promises in modern thought. The existentialists again, and behind them a whole tradition, held that a human being is not a fixed thing with a fixed essence but a project, something that makes itself through its choices. Sartre had a phrase for it: existence precedes essence, meaning we exist first, as raw, undefined freedom, and only afterward, through what we do, does anything like a settled self come into being. On paper that sounds liberating, and to a certain kind of reader it is thrilling. You are not trapped as the person your job, and your family, and your fear have made you. You can author yourself, you can become. But Breaking Bad takes that beautiful, terrifying idea and runs the experiment to its conclusion. And the conclusion is not a self-help poster. Because here is the trouble with self-creation once you take the guardrails off. If you are free to invent your own self, you are also free to invent one with no floor under it. Walt authors Heisenberg, the way Sartre said, we all author ourselves, through deed after deed, but the deeds are poisonings and stranglings, and the slow, deliberate corruption of a young man who trusted him. Heisenberg is a genuine achievement of the will. That is what makes him monstrous. He is not something that happens to Walt. He is something Walt makes, with the same care and the same pride he once put into founding a company. And the series wants you to feel the awful craftsmanship of it. And notice how the two selves start to trade places. In the early going, Walter White is the real man, and Heisenberg is the mask, the thing he puts on to go do business, and takes off to come home and eat dinner. But masks have a way of eating the face underneath. By the middle of the series you can no longer be sure which one is the performance. When he is being gentle with his son, is that Walt, or is that Heisenberg keeping up appearances, managing the people around him the way he manages everyone else? When he tells Skyler a soft lie in a calm voice, the calm is the mask working. Breaking Bad slyly reverses the polarity on you, so that by the end the frightening question is not whether Heisenberg is real, but whether Walter White, the good man, the reason we started rooting for any of this, was ever the deeper truth, or just the first and best of Walt's disguises. That is the uncertainty principle again, pointed inward. Walt cannot measure himself either. He keeps insisting, right up until the last hour of the story, that he knows exactly who he is and why he did all of it, and the tragedy is that he is the person with the least access to the truth of his own motives. The physicist's principle says the observer changes the observed. Walt is both. Every time he looks at himself and declares this is who I am, and this is why, the looking is already a lie he is telling, because the self doing the looking is the self with the most reasons to flatter itself. He is a blurred particle trying to pin down its own position, and the harder he tries, the less he sees. So the name he picks in a moment of bravado in front of a dangerous man turns out to be the truest thing he ever says without knowing it, and he does not even know he is saying it. He reaches for a name that sounds like power, and he accidentally names the exact thing that will make him impossible to save, impossible to reach, impossible to know, even for the people who love him, even for himself. Heisenberg. The one who cannot be measured. It is the kind of accident only very careful writers can arrange, and it sits at the center of everything the show believes about how little we can ever really know the interior of another person, or, if we are honest, of our own. If there is one sentence Walter White says more than any other across 5 seasons, it is some version of the same 3 words. I did it for my family. He says it to Skyler, he says it to Jesse, he says it to Hank, he says it into the camcorder, he says it to himself in the dark when no one is listening. It is his refrain, his prayer, the load-bearing wall of the entire building. Everything he does, every line he crosses, every person he lets fall, is filed under that heading. Not for me, for them. And the series spends 5 seasons very slowly, very patiently, taking that wall apart brick by brick until you can see straight through it. There is a philosophical name for what Walt is doing when he says it, and it belongs again to Sartre, who called it bad faith. Bad faith is not ordinary lying, where you know the truth and tell someone else a falsehood. Bad faith is subtler and sadder than that. It is lying to yourself. It is the way a person, faced with the vertigo of their own freedom, hides from it by pretending they had no choice, that their role or their circumstances or their obligations forced their hand, that they were simply doing what a man in their position must do. Sartre's famous example is a waiter who performs being a waiter so completely, so eagerly, that he disappears into the role and gets to stop being a free person who chose it. Bad faith is the comfort of pretending you are a thing that must, rather than a person who decides. And I did it for my family is one of the purest examples of bad faith you will find in any American story, because it lets Walt do exactly as he pleases while telling himself he had no self at all in the matter, only a duty. Watch how the excuse holds up against the actual sequence of events, because this is where Breaking Bad is merciless. Early on, there is a genuine case to be made. He is dying, the treatment is ruinous, his family will be left with nothing, and there is a skill in his hands that can make more money faster than anything else available to a man with 2 years to live. You can almost sign off on it. But then the story starts closing the doors on the excuse one by one. In the first season, Walt's former partners at Grey Matter, the very people whose success has haunted him for 20 years, offer to pay for his treatment outright. No strings that matter. He would live, his family would be safe, and the cancer bills would vanish. And he says no. He says no because taking their charity would mean admitting he needs them, would mean standing again as the poor relation, and his pride will not survive it. Right there, in the first stretch of the show, the For My Family story is already false, because he has handed his family's safety on a plate, and he pushes it away to protect something in himself. It only gets clearer from there. He turns down help. He keeps cooking long after the medical debt is paid. He keeps cooking after there is more money buried in the desert than his family could spend in several lifetimes. So much cash that Skyler eventually stands in a storage unit in front of a pile of it the size of a small car and asks him, with real exhaustion, how much is enough? There is no answer he can give her that involves the children. The money stopped being about the family a long time ago, and everyone can see it except the man holding the shovel. He is not providing. He is accumulating, and accumulating is a hunger that has nothing to do with anyone's college fund. What makes this more than just hypocrisy, and what raises it to the level of tragedy, is that I do not think Walt is simply lying when he says it. That is the thing about bad faith, and it is why Sartre thought it was so much more dangerous than ordinary dishonesty. Walt believes it. In the moment he says, "I did it for my family," some real part of him means it with his whole chest, which is precisely how the self-deception protects him. If he knew he was lying, he could stop. He could face what he actually wants and either master it or be horrified by it. But because he half believes his own alibi, he never has to look directly at the appetite underneath. The excuse is not a con he runs on Skyler. It is an anesthetic he takes, so he does not have to feel what he is. And this is the part that truly breaks my heart about the character, because it means Walt spends nearly the entire series a stranger to himself. He is a brilliant man, careful and analytical, capable of solving almost any problem you put in front of him, and there is exactly one problem he cannot solve, which is the question of what he actually wants and why. He builds an empire and cannot see the man who wanted it. He tells his wife he is doing it all for her and the kids while he is, in truth, doing it because for the first time in his adult life he feels enormous, and he cannot say that out loud, cannot even fully think it, because the day he thinks it is the day the whole moral structure he lives inside comes down. The series is so confident about this reading that it saves the correction for the very last hour, and it lets Walt himself deliver it, which is the only reason it lands with the force it does. But we will come to the finale in its own time. For now what matters is the shape of the lie and the elegance of the way the writing dismantles it. The genius is that they never have another character simply announce that Walt is selfish. Skyler suspects it, Jesse feels it, Hank comes to know it, but Breaking Bad does not hand you a speech. It just keeps calmly removing every external reason for Walt to continue. The treatment gets paid for, the debt clears, the fortune grows obscene, the family begs him to stop, and he keeps going anyway, until the For My Family banner is flying over a battlefield that has nothing to do with them and never did. You are left to draw the only conclusion the evidence allows, which is that the reason was never outside him. It was inside him the whole time, wearing the face of a devoted father, and it took him 2 years and the loss of everything to finally take the mask off and say the true thing. Go back to the very beginning of his career in crime, to the first lives he takes, because the way the story handles Walt's first 2 killings tells you almost everything about the moral machine running inside him. In the pilot, Walt and Jesse are cornered by 2 dangerous men, Emilio and a dealer who goes by Crazy 8, whose real name we later learn is Domingo. Walt, using nothing but chemistry, and a locked space, and his own quick mind, produces a cloud of poison gas from ordinary materials, and one of the two men, Emilio, dies. The other, Crazy 8, survives, and Walt ends up holding him prisoner, chained in Jesse's basement, while he tries to decide what on earth to do with a living human being he has no safe way to release, and no stomach to kill. I am not going to walk through the mechanics of any of it, because that is not what the show is interested in, and it is not what we are here for. What the series is interested in is the accounting, because Walt, faced with the question of whether to kill the man in the basement, does the most Walter White thing imaginable. He makes a list. He takes a piece of paper and he draws a line down the middle. Reasons to let him live on one side, reasons to kill him on the other. It is the pros and cons list of a man deciding whether to change jobs, applied to the question of ending a life, and it is one of the quietest and most chilling scenes in the early show, precisely because it is so calm, so orderly, so recognizably the behavior of a reasonable person weighing a decision. That list is Breaking Bad handing you Walt's operating philosophy in its clearest early form, and it has a name in ethics. It is a rough, homemade version of consequentialism, the family of moral theories that says the rightness of an action is determined by its outcomes, by the balance of good and bad consequences it produces, rather than by any rule about the kind of action it is in itself. The most famous branch of it is utilitarianism, the idea associated with thinkers like Bentham and Mill that we should act so as to produce the greatest good for the greatest number, that morality is finally a kind of arithmetic of well-being. On the consequentialist view, there are no actions that are simply forbidden, regardless of what they bring about. There is only the sum, you add up the outcomes and you choose the larger total. Walt is a consequentialist to the marrow, and it is not hard to see why the philosophy suits him. He is a scientist. He believes in measurement, in reason, in following the logic of a situation wherever it goes. And consequentialism, in the wrong hands, gives a clever man a machine for justifying nearly anything, because if the only thing that matters is the final tally, then a sufficiently large good on the far end can be made to balance almost any horror on the near end. My family will be provided for. That is the good on the far side of the ledger, enormous, glowing, and against it, Walt can weigh a great many terrible things and always come out, in his own arithmetic, on the side of yes. The reasoning is a solvent. It dissolves the ordinary human sense that some things are simply not to be done. But here is what fascinates me about those first two killings, and it is a detail the story is very deliberate about. Walt is queasy. He is not yet the man who can do the arithmetic and feel nothing. When he goes down to that basement to face Crazy 8, the decision is agony for him. He brings the man food. He talks with him, learns about his life, his family's furniture store, comes to see him as a person, and the whole thing nearly convinces Walt to let him go, and there is a real sense that he wants to, that the reasonable pros and cons list is at war with something older and softer in him that recoils from the act. The killing, when it comes, is close and physical and awful, and Walt is wrecked by it. He weeps. He is sick over it. At this stage, there is still a Walter White standing between the arithmetic and the deed, a man whose conscience drags on the machinery. And that is the tragedy in miniature, because the whole arc of the series is the story of that drag disappearing. The consequentialist reasoning stays exactly the same from the first season to the last. What changes is that the queasiness, the weeping, the sickness, the human friction that once slowed the arithmetic down, gets sanded away a little more with each crossing, until by the later seasons, Walt can order a dozen people killed in prisons across the state, in the space of a couple of minutes, and go home and eat breakfast. The philosophy did not get worse. The philosophy was always capable of this. It was the man running it who had, at the start, a set of feelings that fought the conclusions, and one by one those feelings die, and the machine keeps running with nothing left to resist it. This is one of the oldest and most powerful criticisms of pure consequentialism, and the show dramatizes it better than any lecture could. The worry the critics have always had is exactly this, that a morality made only of outcomes gives you no place to stand when the outcomes seem to demand something monstrous, that it turns the human being into a calculator and then trusts the calculator with everything, and that a person who has trained themselves to feel only the final sum has trained away the very instincts that make them safe to be around. Walt is the experiment. He starts as a man with a conscience and a calculator, and the series is the long, slow record of the calculator winning, of the reasons getting easier and the feelings getting quieter, until the machine that once needed a whole night and a piece of paper and a flood of tears to justify one death can justify a massacre before lunch and never break stride. The horror is not that his logic changes. The horror is that it never has to. There is a single act, near the end of the second season, that most people who have watched Breaking Bad point to as the moment Walter White stops being a man who has done bad things and becomes something else entirely. It is not a killing, exactly. That is what makes it worse. Jesse has fallen in love with a woman named Jane, his neighbor, an artist and a recovering addict, and through her Jesse has fallen back into heroin. Jane, for her part, has leverage over Walt, and she is pulling Jesse away from him and away from the business. And one night Walt comes to Jesse's apartment to find the two of them unconscious, having used, lying together on the bed. As Walt tries to rouse Jesse, Jane, on her back, begins to choke on her own vomit, the way people in that state tragically do. And Walt, standing there, watches her choke to death and does nothing. He could turn her onto her side. It would take a second. He chooses not to, and he watches until she is gone. That scene is the story at its most surgical, and I want to be careful about how I describe what happens, because it matters enormously that Walt does not kill Jane. He lets her die. The distinction is the whole point, and the show knows it, which is why it stages the death this way rather than any other. If Walt had smothered her, we would file it with his other killings. Terrible but active, a thing done in the heat of a threat. But he does not lift a finger. He simply withholds the one small motion that would save a life, and stands inside his own stillness, while a young woman dies a few feet away, and then walks out. It is murder by omission, and there is a long and uncomfortable tradition in ethics of arguing about whether letting die is really so different from killing, whether the man who watches a child drown when he could easily wade in is truly less guilty than the man who pushes the child in. Most of us feel there is a difference. The series is not so sure, and it stages the scene precisely to make you feel the ground shift under that comfortable distinction. What the moment really tests, though, is the question of freedom and responsibility, because Walt spends the aftermath telling himself a familiar story, that there was nothing he could do, that she was an addict, and this was where she was headed, that it was not really his hand at all. And every part of that is a lie built to protect him from the truth, which is that in that room he was as free as a person ever is. There was no gun to his head, no ticking clock, no drug lord forcing his hand. There was only a man and a choice and a few seconds, and in those seconds he weighed a human life against the survival of his enterprise and his hold over his partner, and he chose the enterprise. That is radical freedom in the existentialist sense, the terrible open space in which a person authors themselves through a single act, and Walt uses his freedom, in the clear light of a quiet bedroom, to let someone die because it is convenient. There is nowhere to hide the responsibility. He owned every second of it. And then Breaking Bad does something that lifts the whole thing out of the personal and into something closer to Greek tragedy, or maybe scripture. It follows the consequence outward. Jane's father is a man named Donald Margolis, and he is an air traffic controller, and he is destroyed by the loss of his daughter, and in his grief, distracted and broken at his station, he makes an error that causes two planes to collide in the sky over Albuquerque. 167 people die. The season closes on debris raining down over the city, over Walt's own neighborhood, a pink child's toy from one of the planes floating in his swimming pool, and the staggering, deliberate implication is that all of it, every one of those deaths, traces back along an unbroken chain of cause to a man who declined to turn a woman onto her side. Now, I want to flag clearly that this is the story reaching for something almost mythological, and you can read it two ways. The literal cause and effect chain is real within the story. The writers built it on purpose, link by link, from Walt's inaction to Jane's death to her father's grief to the crash. But the meaning of that chain is interpretive, and the show leaves the interpretation open. One reading is cosmic, that there is a moral order to this universe, and it is punishing Walt, raining the wreckage down on his own house, to say, look what you set in motion. Another reading, the one I lean toward, is bleaker and more modern, that there is no cosmic bookkeeper at all, that the universe does not care, and that the horror is simply the truth about consequences in a world without a safety net, that a single selfish act ripples outward through other free people in ways no one can predict or contain, and that a man who tells himself his choices are private and contained is telling himself the oldest lie there is. Either way, the falling debris is the answer to Walt's whole philosophy of the ledger. Remember the pros and cons list, the calm arithmetic, the idea that you can weigh an act's consequences, add them up, and know whether it was right. The plane crash is Breaking Bad's reply to that fantasy. You cannot see the whole ledger. You never can. Walt's arithmetic on the night of Jane's death would have counted one life against the stability of his operation and called it a reasonable trade, and the arithmetic would have been blind, as all such arithmetic is blind, to the 167 names it was actually signing off on. Consequentialism promises that you can calculate the outcomes. The sky over Albuquerque falling into Walt's pool is the series saying, quietly and without mercy, that you cannot. That the consequences of a single cold choice run out past the edge of any list a person could ever make, and that the man who thinks he has done the math has understood nothing at all. Late in the third season, there is a conversation that gives the whole series one of its guiding phrases, and it does not come from Walt at all. It comes from Mike Ehrmantraut, the aging fixer and former cop who works for the people Walt is entangled with. A man who has seen more of this world than Walt ever will, and carries it all with a kind of tired, unshowy competence. Jesse is in a dangerous spot, wanting to move against a pair of dealers who have done something unforgivable to a child, and Mike, trying to talk him down, tells him a story from his days as a beat cop. There was a man who beat his wife, and Mike, called out to the house, had the man dead to rights, could have ended it, but chose instead a half measure. He leaned on the man, warned him, frightened him, and let him go, telling himself he had done enough, that he had shown mercy, that a full measure was more than the situation required. And 2 weeks later the man killed her. And Mike delivers the lesson he has carried ever since in a single flat line. No more half measures. On its surface it is tactical advice. It means, in the brutal logic of the world they live in, that if you are going to move against an enemy, you must move all the way, because a threat left half dealt with comes back worse than if you had never acted at all. And within the story it works as exactly that kind of advice. And Walt hears it, and it changes him, because at the end of that same run of episodes, Walt does something decisive and violent to protect Jesse, running down the two dealers with his car and finishing the survivor, and then, in the aftermath, telling Jesse to run. He has taken the full measure. He has stopped hesitating, and a great many viewers mark that as another threshold crossed, another piece of the old Walt burned away. But I think the idea of half measures runs much deeper into Breaking Bad's philosophy than a piece of gangland strategy, and it connects to something the ancient thinkers worried about a great deal, which is the relationship between the small choice and the settled character. There is an old idea, going back to Aristotle, that we become what we repeatedly do, that virtue and vice are not things you are born with but habits you build one action at a time, that a person becomes courageous by performing courageous acts and becomes cruel by performing cruel ones, until the acts stop requiring a decision and simply flow out of a character that has been shaped to produce them. On this view, there is no such thing as a private, contained bad act that leaves the rest of you untouched. Every choice is also a small act of self-construction. Every half measure and every full measure is not just a response to the world, but a stroke in the ongoing drawing of who you are. Read through that lens, no more half measures becomes something much darker than tactical wisdom. It becomes the motto of a man building himself into something without the friction of hesitation, and Walt takes to it with an appetite that should worry us. Because the tragedy of the half measure, in Mike's own telling, is a tragedy of mercy failing, of a man who tried to be gentle and got someone killed for it. But watch what Walt does with the lesson. He does not hear a story about the limits of mercy, and grow more careful, more grieved, more aware of the weight of these decisions. He hears permission to stop being gentle at all. He hears the full measure recast, not as a grim necessity to be mourned, but as a kind of manhood to be embraced. And from that point on, the hesitation that once made him weep in abasement is reframed, in his own mind, as weakness, as the half measure he must purge from himself. This is the sleight of hand Breaking Bad pulls with the phrase, and it is why I do not think we are simply meant to nod along when Walt takes the full measure. Mike's story is deeply tragic and genuinely wise. It really is true that in his violent world half measures get people killed. But Walt launders that hard-won, sorrowful wisdom into a justification for becoming harder, and the two are not the same thing. Mike carries the beat cop story as a wound, as a thing he regrets, as the reason he does what he does, with a heavy heart and no illusions. Walt takes the same words and hears a green light. The identical philosophy, no more half measures, sounds like mournful realism in Mike's mouth, and like a war cry in Walt's. And the difference is everything. because it is the difference between a man who has made peace with doing hard things and a man who has fallen in love with them. And here is the part that stays with me. The story spends its whole length showing you that Walt's real problem was never that he did too many half measures. If anything, it was the opposite. From the day of his diagnosis, he refuses every half measure available to him: the charity, the retirement, the good enough pile of money, the chance to walk away clean a dozen times over. A half measure, in the ordinary human sense, is often just the wisdom to know when enough is enough, to stop, to accept a smaller and safer outcome, rather than press all the way to the total victory. That kind of half measure might have saved everyone Walt loved. But he has taken Mike's phrase and turned it into a prohibition against ever stopping, against ever settling, against ever being satisfied with less than the whole thing, and so the one measure he most desperately needs, the measure of restraint, of knowing when to quit, becomes the one thing his adopted philosophy forbids him from ever taking. He purges the half measure that would have destroyed him and keeps taking the full measures that actually do. In the 4th season, in an episode called Cornered, Skyler says something to Walt that any frightened wife might say to a husband who has fallen in with dangerous people. She is afraid for him. She has come to understand that he is mixed up in a world where people get killed, and she tells him, in so many words, that she is scared, that she does not want him to end up like the men who open their doors and get shot. She is trying to reach the husband she thought she knew, the vulnerable one, the one who needs protecting. And Walt turns to her and delivers the speech that has probably been quoted more than anything else he says in the entire series. He tells her she has it backwards, that she thinks he is in danger, and then, with a calm that is somehow more frightening than any shouting, he corrects her. "I am not in danger, Skyler. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No, I am the one who knocks." It is a magnificent and horrible little speech, and it is the clearest window the show ever gives you into the philosophy that has taken hold of him by this point, because what Walt is describing, in the language of a drug war, is almost exactly what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called the will to power. Nietzsche argued across many books and in many moods that the fundamental drive of living things is not the desire for pleasure, or even the desire to survive, but a deeper striving to grow, to overcome, to expand, to impose form on the world and on oneself, to become more. He called it the will to power, and he did not mean it in the crude sense of wanting to boss people around, though it can look like that. He meant something closer to the basic engine of life itself, the drive of a thing to be more fully and more forcefully what it is, to master resistance, to climb. And when Walt says he is the one who knocks, he is announcing that he has found that engine in himself and given it the throttle, that he is no longer the man things happen to, but the force that makes things happen to others, the cause rather than the effect, the knock on the door rather than the man who flinches at it. You have to understand what this means to a man like Walt, to feel the full pull of it. For 20 years he has been the effect. The world acted on him. His partners got rich, his body got sick, his students ignored him, his brother-in-law, the DEA agent, loomed over the dinner table as the confident, joking, physically imposing alpha, while Walt sat small and swallowed it. He has been, in his own eyes, a passive thing, a man to whom life is done, and the will to power, the thing that wakes in him after the diagnosis, is the sheer intoxication of reversing that, of being for the first time the one with the initiative, the one who decides, the one before whom other people go quiet and afraid. This is why the money stops mattering. Money was never the point. Power was the point, and power in the specific flavor Walt craves, which is the power to no longer be the one who gets acted upon, to be at last the subject of the sentence instead of the object. Nietzsche also drew a distinction that maps onto Walt with almost uncomfortable precision, his famous contrast between what he called master morality and slave morality. In master morality, Nietzsche said, "The strong and the noble simply affirm themselves, calling good whatever expresses their own strength and vitality, and calling bad whatever is weak and pitiful." It is a morality of self-assertion, created by those who feel powerful, looking down. Slave morality, by contrast, is what he thought arose among the weak and the oppressed, a morality that calls the powerful evil and elevates the qualities of the powerless, humility, meekness, patience, obedience, turning weakness into virtue because it cannot manage strength. And Nietzsche's provocative, dangerous claim was that much of conventional morality, especially the morality of self-denial and turning the other cheek, is really slave morality, a clever revenge of the weak against the strong, dressed up as goodness. Now, I have to be careful here, because it is very easy to hear all of this and conclude that the series is endorsing it, that Breaking Bad is a Nietzschean fable cheering Walt on as he throws off the slave morality of the meek schoolteacher and claims his rightful place as a master. And a certain kind of viewer does watch it that way, thrilling to Heisenberg, wanting him to win, reading the mild early Walt as the contemptible slave, and the ruthless later Walt as the liberated master who finally stopped apologizing for existing. That reading is real, and the series is well aware of it, and it deliberately seduces you into it for long stretches, because it wants you to feel the appeal, wants you to understand exactly why a beaten-down man would find this philosophy the headiest drink he has ever tasted. If you never feel the pull of that declaration, you have not really watched Breaking Bad. You are supposed to feel it. That is the trap. But I do not think the series believes it, and the reason is that Breaking Bad keeps its eye fixed on everyone standing on the other side of Walt's self-assertion. Nietzsche's master looks magnificent when you stand behind him and look out at the world through his eyes. The trouble is that Walt's will to power is not exercised in some vacuum where his becoming costs no one anything. Every increase in Walt's power is subtracted from someone else. His largeness is built out of other people's smallness, out of Jesse's ruin and Skyler's terror, and a child poisoned and a young woman left to die, and 167 names falling out of the sky. The will to power, as the story stages it, is not a private act of self-overcoming that harms no one. It is a transfer. Walt gets to be the one who knocks only because he has made everyone around him into the one who opens the door and flinches. And so the very speech that sounds like a triumphant declaration of strength is also, if you look past Walt's face to the woman he is saying it to, the sound of a marriage dying, a wife realizing in real time that the man across from her is gone, and something else is wearing his sweater. The philosophy sounds like power. The framing shows you the cost, and the cost is always, always somebody else. Since we are already standing inside Nietzsche's ideas, this is the place to deal with the one that gets thrown at Walter White more than any other, usually by people who have half remembered a philosophy class, and that is the idea of the Übermensch, the overman, sometimes translated as the Superman, though that word now drags a cape and a red S behind it that has nothing to do with what Nietzsche meant. In his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche imagined the Übermensch as a kind of future human being, one who has fully accepted that the old sources of meaning have collapsed, that, as he put it in his most famous and most misunderstood line, God is dead, meaning not a cheerful atheism, but a civilizational earthquake, the realization that the entire structure of values Western people had hung their lives on had silently lost its foundation. And into that vacuum, that terrifying open space where the old certainties used to be, Nietzsche placed the overman as his answer, the human being strong enough to create new values out of themselves, to say yes to life in all its difficulty, to become a source of meaning, rather than a mere follower of inherited rules. And you can see immediately why people reach for it when they talk about Walt. Here is a man who lives in a world where the old promises have failed him, where being good and playing by the rules got him a small house and a terminal diagnosis, and a lifetime of watching lesser men prosper. Here is a man who, faced with that failure, refuses to keep worshipping the values that betrayed him, and instead invents his own, who says the herd's morality does not apply to me, who becomes, through sheer force of will, a self-created being living by a law he wrote himself. On the surface, it is a tidy fit, and there are whole video essays and undergraduate papers arguing that Walter White is Nietzsche's overman brought vividly to life, the man who dared to transcend conventional morality and become a law unto himself. I think that reading is wrong, and I think it is wrong in a way that actually matters, because it flatters both Walt and the philosophy in a way neither deserves. Scholars who know Nietzsche well are usually quick to point out that Walt is precisely not an Übermensch, that he is closer to a warning about the thing than an example of it, and the reasons are worth sitting with, because they tell you what the overman was actually supposed to be, as opposed to the cartoon of a ruthless strongman that popular culture turned it into. The first reason is that Nietzsche's overman is fundamentally life-affirming and creative, not resentful and destructive. The whole point of the figure is that he has moved beyond resentment, beyond the poisonous backward-looking grudge that Nietzsche thought corroded the weak, and becomes someone who creates, who gives, who overflows. And Walt is made almost entirely of resentment. Everything he builds is built out of a 20-year grudge. out of the wound of gray matter, out of the need to prove something to people who wronged him, out of I will not be the poor relation again. He is not overflowing with new life-affirming values. He is settling an old score with the world, and settling scores is exactly the small, backward, resentful posture Nietzsche wanted his overman to have grown out of. Walt is not beyond resentment. Walt is resentment with a chemistry degree. The second reason is that the overman, properly understood, creates values that others might live by, that affirm and elevate life in general, whereas everything Walt creates is purely for the enlargement of Walt. He builds nothing that outlasts him or blesses anyone else. His empire produces a product that poisons the people who use it. His self-creation has no room in it for anyone but himself, and it leaves every life it touches smaller, poorer, more frightened, or ended. The overman was supposed to be a gift to the future. Walt is a subtraction from everyone in his present. To create your own values in Nietzsche's sense was a tremendous act of generosity and courage aimed outward at what humanity might become. Walt's self-creation is aimed entirely inward, at his own hunger, and the values he lives by come down, when you strip away the speeches, to the single value of his own supremacy. So if Walt is not the overman, what is he, in Nietzsche's own scheme? I think the honest answer is that he is something Nietzsche actually described and feared, the person who has correctly understood that the old values have collapsed, but who is not strong enough or good enough to build anything worthy in their place, and who therefore fills the vacuum with nothing but appetite and will. Nietzsche worried a great deal about this, about what happens in the space after the death of the old certainties, if the wrong kind of person gets there first, if the freedom from inherited morality is seized not by a creator, but by a predator. He knew that the same insight, that you can create your own values, is liberating in the hands of a great soul and catastrophic in the hands of a wounded, grasping one. Walt is the catastrophic version. He got the first half of the lesson, that the old rules need not bind him, and he never had the second half in him, the part about what you are supposed to build once you are free. This is why I find the show quietly, and I mean this word precisely, more moral than a lot of its loudest fans. It stages the seduction of the Nietzschean fantasy completely, lets you feel every ounce of the appeal of a man throwing off the herd and becoming a law unto himself, and then it shows you, patiently and without a single lecture, what that fantasy actually produces when a real and limited and wounded human being tries to live it. Not a magnificent creator ushering in a higher humanity. A frightened, vain man in a rented apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of everyone who ever loved him, mistaking the size of his fear for the size of his soul. The overman was a mountain Nietzsche pointed to in the distance. Walt is what it looks like when a man convinces himself he has climbed it while he is, in truth, still standing in the same valley he started in, only now with blood on his hands and no one left to see him. By the 5th season, the money problem is solved several times over, and the series does something bold with that fact. It removes the last shred of the family excuse and lets you watch, unobstructed, the thing that was really driving him all along. In an episode called Buyout, there is a scene where Jesse and Mike are ready to sell out, to take a large and final payday and be done, and they want Walt to do the same, to walk away rich and alive and free. And Walt cannot do it. He tries to explain why, and in doing so he says a line that gives more away than almost anything else in the whole series. Jesse asks whether this is about the money or the meth, and Walt tells him it is neither, that he is not in the meth business or the money business. He is, he says, in the empire business. The empire business. Consider the strangeness of that phrase for a moment, because a man who was truly in this for his family would have no idea what it means. Families do not need empires. Families need enough. Empire is a want with no ceiling, a hunger that by definition can never be satisfied, because an empire is not a fixed amount of anything. It is a direction, an appetite for more that feeds on its own success. And when Walt names his true business as empire, he is telling you, and telling Jesse, and refusing to tell himself, that there was never going to be a stopping point, that the whole language of doing this until the family is safe was always a fiction, because empire does not have a safe. Empire has only more. This is the point in the story where Breaking Bad stops being merely a crime drama and starts openly wearing the clothes of Greek tragedy, and the fit is so exact that I think the writers knew precisely what they were doing. The Greeks had a whole vocabulary for the shape of a great man's downfall, and Walt's arc hits every mark of it. There is hubris, the overreaching pride that makes a man believe he is beyond the ordinary limits that bind other people, that he can knock rather than be knocked, that the rules of consequence do not apply to him. There is hamartia, usually translated as the tragic flaw, though it more literally means a missing of the mark, an error, and Walt's is precisely his pride, the same pride that walked away from gray matter and could not accept charity and cannot now accept enough. The Greeks understood that the flaw that destroys a great man is very often just the exaggerated form of the quality that made him great in the first place. Walt's brilliance and Walt's pride are the same trait wearing two faces, and the story never lets you separate them. And then there is the moment the Greeks called peripeteia, the reversal, where the hero's fortunes turn and the very things he did to secure himself become the machinery of his ruin, and hovering over all of it, nemesis, the retribution that pride calls down upon itself, not always from the gods, but sometimes just from the iron logic of a world that will not be dominated forever. Walt's whole fifth season is the slow tightening of that ancient machine. The higher he climbs, the more precarious the height, and the show films his ascent with an increasing sense of dread, precisely because anyone who knows how these stories go can feel the reversal gathering. The purest expression of the hubris comes in the very next episode, called Say My Name, in a scene out in the desert where Walt goes to negotiate with a rival distributor named Declan. Declan and his men have the numbers, the guns, the leverage. By every practical measure, Walt should be careful. Instead, he walks out onto the open ground and dictates terms. And when Declan questions who he thinks he is, Walt refuses to answer with facts or threats. He demands recognition. He tells Declan to say his name, and when the man finally, warily says it, Heisenberg, Walt confirms it with two soft words. You're goddamn right. It is a scene about power, yes, but look at what kind of power Walt actually craves in that moment. He does not most want the money, or the territory, or even the safety. He wants to be named. He wants his enemy to speak his chosen identity out loud, to acknowledge him, to confirm that the small man is now the large one. The deepest hunger in Walter White, the thing underneath the empire and the will to power and all of it, turns out to be a hunger for recognition, to be seen as great by the very world that once looked past him. There is real philosophy in that, and it is older than Nietzsche. Thinkers going back to Hegel argued that a huge part of what drives human beings is precisely the desire for recognition, the need to be acknowledged by others as having worth, and that a great deal of human conflict is at bottom a struggle over whose value gets recognized. Walt is that struggle taken to its extreme. His entire criminal career, read this way, is one long, violent demand to be recognized, a demand aimed at a world that spent 50 years failing to see him. Say My Name is not a tactical line. It is the cry of a man who was invisible for half a century and has decided he would rather be feared than unseen, who would rather be Heisenberg, hated and hunted, than Walter White, decent and overlooked. And the tragedy the Greeks would have recognized instantly is that this craving is bottomless. No amount of recognition can fill the hole in a man who needed it that badly, because the hunger was never really about the world's opinion. It was about a wound in himself that no one else's words could ever reach. So he stands in the desert and makes his enemy say his name, and it is the height of his power, and it is exactly the kind of height from which these stories always fall. The Greeks would have seen the ending in that scene, would have known that a man who demands the gods, or the world, or fate, acknowledge his greatness in those terms has already sealed his ruin, because pride that loud is an invitation the universe of the story never declines. Walt gets his name said. He gets his empire. He gets, for one season, everything the schoolteacher never had, and the machine of the tragedy, ancient and patient and utterly reliable, has already begun to turn the whole thing into the instrument of his fall. If there is a single act in the series that even Walt's defenders struggle to explain away, it is what he does to a child named Brock. By the end of the fourth season, Walt is cornered between two forces that could destroy him, the calm and terrifying drug lord Gus Fring on one side and his own dwindling options on the other, and the one card he has left to play is Jesse. Jesse has grown close to Gus, has been turned against Walt, and Walt needs him back, needs Jesse to hate Gus enough to help move against him. And so Walt engineers a situation in which Brock, the young son of Jesse's girlfriend, a little boy Jesse loves, falls gravely ill, poisoned. Jesse, terrified, becomes convinced that the poison is ricin, a substance he knows Walt has, and for a while he believes Walt is responsible and nearly kills him for it. Walt talks his way out of it, redirects Jesse's fury toward Gus, and it works. Jesse comes back. The plan against Gus goes forward, and the boy, mercifully, survives. The series later reveals the crucial detail, which is that the poison was not ricin at all, but berries from a plant called lily of the valley, a common ornamental with beautiful little white flowers that happens to be toxic, and the final shot of that season lingers on a potted lily of the valley in Walt's own backyard, quietly confirming what the audience had feared, and Jesse never quite proved, that Walt did this, that he deliberately poisoned a child to manipulate a grieving young man into rejoining his war. It is one of the coldest reveals in television, and it works precisely because it is withheld, because Breaking Bad makes you sit in the ambiguity and then, without a word of dialogue, shows you the plant and lets the horror land in silence. I think this is the act where Walt's whole philosophy stops being interestingly complicated and becomes something closer to a straightforward study of evil, and it is worth asking what kind of evil it actually is, because it is not the kind we usually imagine. Walt does not poison Brock out of cruelty. He takes no pleasure in the child's suffering. He is not a sadist. What he does is worse, in a way, and more modern, and more chilling for how recognizable it is. He treats the child as a tool. Brock is not a person to Walt in the moment he plans it. Brock is a variable, an input, a lever that will produce the output Walt requires, which is Jesse's renewed loyalty. The little boy's life is placed into the arithmetic as a quantity, weighed against the survival of the empire, and found acceptable to risk. The philosopher Immanuel Kant built an entire moral system around the one principle Walt violates here, more nakedly than anywhere else in the series. Kant argued that the core of morality is to treat humanity, whether in yourself or in any other person, always as an end, and never merely as a means. What he meant is that people are not tools. They have a dignity that forbids you from using them purely as instruments for your own purposes. That a human being is not a thing to be deployed like a lever or a chemical, but a center of worth in their own right, to be respected as such. Almost every wrong you can name, in Kant's view, comes down to a violation of that principle, to the reduction of a person to a mere means, and Walt, in poisoning Brock, commits the purest possible version of it. He takes a child, a being of absolute innocence and absolute dignity, and converts him entirely into a means, a device for adjusting another man's emotions. There is no more complete way to treat a person as a thing than to poison them, not out of hatred, but out of usefulness. This is why I do not think the story is finally undecided about Walt, even though it loves ambiguity and withholds judgment for long stretches. There is a difference between a story that refuses to judge and a story that trusts you to. Breaking Bad shows you the lily of the valley in the pot and says nothing, and the silence is not neutrality. The silence is confidence. It knows that you know. It knows that no speech about the nature of evil could possibly hit as hard as one lingering shot of a pretty poisonous flower growing peacefully in the backyard of a man who used it on a child. And it is right. And what makes it worse, what the image insists on, is the ordinariness of it. The plant is just sitting there in the sun. Decorative, unremarkable, the kind of thing you might walk past in any garden. Evil, the show keeps suggesting, does not arrive with horns and a dramatic score. It grows in a pot in the backyard. It wears a cardigan. It tells itself it had good reasons. And Walt did have reasons, that is the terrible thing. Reasons that fit his philosophy perfectly. Within the logic of the Empire, poisoning Brock was efficient. It solved the problem. It brought Jesse back. It enabled the move against Gus. It protected the operation, and by extension, in Walt's endless self-justifying arithmetic, his family. Every step of it can be defended by the consequentialist machine we watched him build, the machine that counts only outcomes and treats every person and every act as a quantity to be weighed. Brock lived, Gus fell, the Empire survived. On the ledger, it balances. And that is exactly the point the series is making, that a morality of pure outcomes, run by a man who has trained away his conscience, will eventually and inevitably arrive at the poisoning of a child and call it a reasonable trade. The lily of the valley is not just proof of what Walt did. It is proof of where his whole philosophy was always going to end up, given enough time and enough pressure. There was a floor under Walter White once, a place his reasoning could not take him. By the end of the 4th season there is no floor left, and a little boy nearly pays for its absence with his life. To understand what kind of man Walt is, it helps enormously to look at the men Breaking Bad places beside him, because the series is built like a hall of mirrors, and almost every major character is a version of one of Walt's possible answers to the question of how to live. The most complete of these mirrors, and in some ways the most frightening, is Gustavo Fring, the drug kingpin who hides in plain sight as the mild-mannered owner of a fast food chain, a pillar of the Albuquerque community, a man who donates to the DEA and shakes the hands of the very agents hunting him. Gus is what Walt thinks he wants to be, and the contrast between them is one long argument the story conducts without ever stating its terms. Because Gus has achieved the thing Walt only plays at. Gus is genuinely powerful, truly feared within his world, the one who knocks, and he has done it while remaining completely invisible, completely controlled, completely without the desperate need to be seen that eats Walt alive. Where Walt demands that his enemies say his name, Gus's entire genius is that no one says his name, that no one even knows there is a name to say. He has separated his power from his ego so cleanly that he can stand in a room full of the people trying to destroy him and feel no need whatsoever to let them know how large he is. His satisfaction is entirely internal. He does not require the world's recognition, and that indifference to being seen is the exact thing Walt can never manage, because Walt's whole hunger is the hunger to be acknowledged, and Gus has no such hunger at all. There is a philosophy in Gus, and it is close to the old Stoic ideal, the discipline of the ancient thinkers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who taught that the highest human achievement is mastery over oneself, the ability to govern one's own reactions, to remain unmoved by fear and by insult and by desire, to act always from cold, clear reason, rather than from the churning of the passions. Gus is a monster, make no mistake, a man who does terrible things and orders terrible deaths, but he is a supremely self-mastered monster. He does not act out of wounded pride or hot anger or the need to prove anything. Every move he makes is patient, considered, planned years in advance, executed without a flicker of emotional need. The most famous illustration of it is a moment where Gus, in order to make a point to the men who work for him, does something shockingly violent with total calm, and then, in the aftermath, walks to a bathroom and adjusts his clothing and composes himself as though he had done nothing more than spill a drink. His control never breaks. The mask never slips, because for Gus, unlike for Walt, there is no frantic person underneath the mask straining to be seen. The mask has become the whole man, and he is at peace with it. Now hold that up against Walt, and you see what the show is telling you about Walt's supposed greatness. Walt is a slave to exactly the passions Gus has mastered. He is driven by pride, by resentment, by the need to be recognized, by rage when he is disrespected, by an appetite that no success can satisfy. Where Gus is cold, Walt is hot, and the series is quite clear about which of the two is actually the more formidable, and it is not the one who makes people say his name. Gus would never demand that. Gus does not need it. Gus understands that the moment you need the world to acknowledge your power, you have handed the world a lever over you, and he would rather have the power and let the world stay ignorant of it than trade 1 ounce of real control for the cheap thrill of being feared out loud. In every scene they share, Gus is the adult, and Walt is the child playing at being a kingpin, and part of what makes Walt so dangerous is precisely that he knows it, that he can feel Gus's superiority, and it enrages him, and the rage is one more passion Gus does not have, and Walt cannot escape. And yet, and this is the turn Breaking Bad makes, and it is why Gus is not simply a model of the good life dressed up as a villain, Gus falls too. He falls because Walt, for all his passion and mess and ego, finds the one crack in Gus's perfect self-mastery, which is Gus's own old wound, his hatred of the Salamanca family who murdered his partner long ago. Walt weaponizes that hatred, arranging things so that Gus's need for revenge against a crippled old enemy named Hector draws him into a room where a bomb is waiting. Gus walks out of that room, in one of Breaking Bad's most indelible images, with half of his face destroyed, and even then, even mortally wounded, his discipline holds for one last moment, and he straightens his tie, an absurd and magnificent gesture of composure, in the second before he collapses dead. Even dying, he will not let the mask slip. He adjusts his tie because control is the last thing he has, and he will keep it until the final heartbeat. What the story is saying with Gus's death is subtle and important. It is not saying that Walt's hot, messy, ego-driven way is better than Gus's cold, controlled way. Both men die. What it is saying is that the perfect self-mastery Gus achieved is not the safe fortress it appears to be, because Gus had a wound too, a passion he had buried rather than truly conquered, the old grief and the old revenge, and a buried passion is not a mastered one, it is only a hidden one, and the day someone finds it, all the discipline in the world cannot save you. The Stoic ideal of the man who feels nothing and needs nothing turns out, in Gus, to have been a performance all along, a magnificent one, but a performance, and underneath it was a man carrying a grudge as old and as consuming as Walt's grudge over gray matter. In the end, the two enemies are more alike than either would admit. Both are men whose entire empire was secretly powered by an old wound they never healed, and both are destroyed the moment that wound is turned against them. Gus just wore a better suit while it happened. If Gus is the mirror that shows Walt what disciplined power looks like, Jesse Pinkman is the mirror that shows him what a conscience looks like, and it is no accident that the show spends more time on Walt and Jesse together than on any other pairing, because their relationship is the moral engine of the entire series. Jesse begins as almost comic relief, a small-time dealer and former student, a screw-up, the kind of young man the world has already written off. Walt looks down on him at first, treats him as an inferior, a junkie, a means. But over 5 seasons, Jesse becomes something the series clearly values above almost everything else, and it is not competence and it is not power. It is the simple, agonizing capacity to feel the weight of what he has done. Here is the crucial difference between them, and Breaking Bad draws it with tremendous care. Both men do terrible things. Both men have blood on their hands. Jesse kills Gale, a gentle chemist who never hurt anyone, in an act that is almost unbearable to watch, and Jesse is present when a child is murdered in the desert by one of their associates, an innocent boy who happened to witness something he should not have. Jesse is not clean, but where Walt's conscience gets quieter with every crossing, sanded down until he can order a massacre and eat breakfast, Jesse's conscience gets louder. Every terrible thing he participates in lands on him with full force and stays there, festering, refusing to be reasoned away. He cannot build the machine that Walt built, the machine that converts a killing into a line on a ledger and moves on. Jesse feels all of it, every time, and it is slowly destroying him, and the story presents this not as weakness, but as the last flickering evidence that he is still a human being. There is a whole tradition in moral philosophy and in literature that treats guilt not as a malfunction to be cured, but as the sound of the moral law still working inside a person. Dostoevsky built entire novels on it, on the idea that a man who does wrong and cannot escape the torment of it is, paradoxically, in better spiritual shape than the man who does wrong and feels nothing, because the torment is proof that something real and good in him is still alive and still fighting. Jesse is that torment given a face. His guilt is unbearable to watch precisely because it is so complete, so unable to be rationalized, and the show wants you to understand that this unbearable guilt is the very thing that makes Jesse worth saving, and Walt, increasingly, not. Walt's peace is the peace of a man who has killed his own conscience. Jesse's misery is the misery of a man whose conscience refuses to die no matter how much he wishes it would. And this is why the series, which is so unsentimental about almost everything, chooses to let Jesse live. It would have been easy, and in some ways more conventionally tragic, to kill him. Instead, the finale sets him free. Walt, at the very end, shields Jesse with his own body from the gunfire, and then frees him from the men who had enslaved and tortured him, and Jesse, given the chance to shoot Walt, to take his revenge for everything, refuses. He throws the gun down. He will not become the thing that Walt became. He drives away from the compound screaming, half mad with what he has survived, but alive and free, and the later film El Camino follows him as he escapes his past entirely, disappearing to a new life in Alaska with the help of a man who makes people vanish. Of all the characters, Jesse is the one Breaking Bad grants something like grace, and the reason is that he never stopped feeling the wrongness of what he did. His conscience cost him everything, his sanity, his peace, nearly his life, and in the moral universe of Breaking Bad, that unbearable cost is what redeems him. The contrast with Walt could not be sharper, and the two men's endings state it plainly without a word of commentary. Walt gets his empire and loses his soul and dies among his machines. Jesse loses everything the world measures, his money, his home, his innocence, his love, and keeps the one thing Walt threw away, which is the ability to know that what he did was wrong and to be broken by it. In the crude accounting of power and success, Walt won and Jesse lost. In the accounting the story actually cares about, it is exactly the reverse. Jesse is a ruin of a man, but he is a human being who drives off into the dark still capable of grief and shame and love. And Walt is a corpse on a warehouse floor who spent his last years feeling almost nothing except the pleasure of being large. What gets me most about their relationship is the way Walt keeps insisting he cares about Jesse, keeps calling him son in his mind and sometimes out loud, while treating him, at every crucial moment, exactly the way he treated Brock, as a means. He lets Jesse's girlfriend die to control him. He poisons a child to manipulate him. He hands Jesse over to his own death, in one of the very late episodes, out of spite and self-preservation, and then in the finale saves him almost as an afterthought, a small mercy at the end of a long betrayal. The relationship is the perfect specimen of Walt's whole philosophy, the way he can feel real affection for a person and still, whenever it counts, reduce them to a tool. He loves Jesse and he uses Jesse, and he never sees the contradiction, because his entire way of being in the world is built on the quiet conviction that the people he loves are also, always, available to be used. Jesse is the one who finally understands this, fully, at the end, and it is the understanding that lets him drop the gun and drive away, because he grasps at last that the worst thing he can do to Walt is not to kill him. It is to refuse to be used one final time, to walk out of the story a free man, and to leave Walt alone with the empire he chose over everyone who ever loved him. Around Walt, the show arranges a whole set of other lives, and each one is a different answer to the question of how a person ought to live in a hard world, which means each one is also a quiet judgment on the answer Walt chose. Take Mike Ehrmantraut, whose beat cop wisdom we heard earlier. Mike is the professional, the man with a code, and his philosophy is the philosophy of the craftsman who has made peace with an ugly trade. Mike does terrible things for the people he works for, but he does them without illusion, without ego, and without pretending they are anything other than what they are. He does not tell himself he is a good man. He does not need an empire. What Mike wants, underneath the hard exterior, is startlingly ordinary. He wants to provide for his granddaughter, a little girl named Kaylee, to leave her something, to do his job well and be paid and go home. Mike is what Walt claims to be, a man doing dark work purely for family, and the reason it is convincing in Mike and hollow in Walt is that Mike actually means it. He has no hunger beyond the practical. He would stop the moment he had enough, and he says as much. And the series makes Walt kill him, which tells you everything. Mike, at the end, is trying to get out, to take his money and disappear and secure Kaylee's future, and Walt needs something from him, a list of names, and Mike refuses, and Walt, in a fit of the exact wounded pride that governs his whole life, shoots him. And then, in the moments after, Walt realizes the killing was completely unnecessary, that he could have gotten what he wanted another way, that he murdered a man out of pure bruised ego, and he says so, almost to himself. It is one of the emptiest and most pathetic of his crimes, a killing that served no purpose at all, except to soothe the sting of being told no, by a man he could not stand to be lesser than. Mike, the pragmatist who never killed without reason, is killed for no reason, by a man who cannot tell the difference anymore between a necessity and an insult to his pride. Then there is Hank Schrader, Walt's brother-in-law, the DEA agent, and Hank is Breaking Bad's embodiment of the law, of the ordinary faith that there is such a thing as justice, and that it is worth serving. For most of the series, Hank is comic on the surface, loud and brash and a little ridiculous, the confident alpha at the family barbecue while Walt shrinks in the corner, and it is easy to underrate him. But Breaking Bad slowly reveals that Hank's swagger sits on top of something genuine, a real belief in right and wrong and a real courage, and also a real vulnerability, the panic attacks and the trauma he hides because his whole identity depends on being the strong one. Hank represents the possibility that the moral order is real, that the bad guy gets caught, that the rules mean something, and his tragedy is that he is right about Walt too late and dies for it. In the episode where the Empire collapses, Hank finally has Walt dead to rights, has won, has done his job, and is killed by Jack Welker's men anyway, out in the desert, while Walt watches and begs for his life, and offers all his money to save him. And Hank, in his last moment, refuses to beg. He tells Walt that Walt is the smartest man he ever knew, and yet too stupid to see that the men holding the guns made up their minds long ago, and then he faces his death without flinching. Hank dies as what he always was, a man who believed in something larger than himself, and the horror of his death is that it is the direct result of Walt's empire, the bill for the will to power coming due on the one man in the family who stood for the law. And then there is Skyler, who is the hardest of the mirrors to look at, because she is the one closest to us, the ordinary person trying to keep a normal life intact, while a monster grows inside her own house. Skyler gets treated badly by a certain slice of the audience, blamed for standing in Walt's way, and I think that reaction is itself a symptom of how seductive Walt's philosophy is, how easily viewers absorb his contempt for anyone who tries to hold him to the ordinary human scale. Because what Skyler actually represents is the moral world Walt is abandoning, the world of consequences and other people, and the slow, difficult work of keeping a family together. When she discovers the truth, she does not simply leave and she does not simply comply. She is pulled, agonizingly, into complicity, laundering his money through the car wash, becoming an accomplice to protect her children even as she is destroyed by what she knows. And she says one of the truest lines in the whole show, that someone has to protect this family from the man who protects this family, catching in a single sentence the exact insanity of Walt's position, the way his supposed protection has become the thing they most need protecting from. Skyler is the philosophy of complicity, of the ordinary decent person who cannot stop the wrong but cannot cleanly escape it either, who gets pulled into the gravity of another person's crime and has to live in the terrible middle, neither innocent nor guilty in any simple way. And her arc is a quiet argument against the whole fantasy of the lone self-creating man, because it insists on the thing Walt's philosophy denies, which is that no one is an island, that a man does not remake himself in a vacuum, that every self-creation is paid for by the people bound to him, and that the wife and the children and the sister and the brother-in-law are not the supporting cast in Walt's opera of self-becoming, but real centers of their own, with their own lives and their own worth, being crushed to make room for his. And underneath all of it, the quietest verdict of all, is Walter Jr., the son, the boy the whole enterprise was supposedly for. He worships his father at the start, and by the end, when he finally learns the truth, he rejects him completely, will not take his money, will not hear his excuses, wants nothing from him but his absence. The child in whose name the empire was built ends up wanting none of it and none of him. If you ever need to measure the total failure of Walt's philosophy, you do not need the philosophers at all. You only need the son, the one Walt claimed to be doing it all for, turning his back and asking his father, in effect, to please just die and leave them alone. That is the answer the family gives to the man who told himself he did it for the family, and it is the most devastating review the story ever writes. There is a book that runs through Breaking Bad like a slow fuse, and it is not a book about crime or chemistry. It is a volume of poetry, Leaves of Grass, by Walt Whitman, and the way the show uses it is as elegant as anything in the entire series, because the book is doing 3 jobs at once, as a plot device, as a thematic key, and as a piece of dramatic irony so perfect it feels almost cruel. The story of that book is worth telling slowly, because it ties together nearly everything we have been circling. It comes into the series through Gail Bodeker, the gentle, brilliant chemist who assists Walt for a time, and who admires him with an almost innocent devotion. Gail is a lover of poetry and of beauty, an odd and touching figure in this brutal world, and he gives Walt a gift, a copy of Leaves of Grass, inscribed by hand. The inscription reads, "To my other favorite W.W., an affectionate little note from one admirer of Walt Whitman to another, because Gail has noticed that his hero Walter White shares initials with the great American poet." It is a sweet, harmless thing, the kind of gift a shy man gives to someone he looks up to, and it becomes, eventually, the single physical object that destroys Walt's entire secret life. Breaking Bad plants the seed early. In an episode called Bullet Points, Hank, still working the Heisenberg case, shows Walt some of Gail's recovered lab notes, which include a reference to WW and even a line about the man Gail idolized, and Hank puzzles over who this WW could be. And Walt, sitting right there, plays it off with a joke, pointing at himself, saying something like, "You got me, it is me, Walter White, WW," laughing it away, and Hank laughs too, and the moment passes. It is a breathtaking piece of writing because Walt tells the exact truth as a joke, hides in plain sight by confessing, and it works, because the truth is too absurd for Hank to see. The initials sit there between them, the whole secret contained in 2 letters, and Hank looks straight at it and does not see. And then, seasons later, in the mid-season episode Gliding Over All, Hank picks up that very inscribed copy of Leaves of Grass, sitting in Walt's bathroom of all places, opens it idly, and reads the inscription, "To my other favorite WW," and in a single silent moment, the whole structure of his understanding rearranges itself, and he knows. He knows that the poetry-loving chemist admired Walter White, that WW is not Walt Whitman at all, or rather is both, and that the man he has been hunting for years, the ghost called Heisenberg, has been sitting across from him at every family dinner, has been in his house, has been his own brother-in-law the entire time. The book Gale gave Walt out of pure admiration becomes the thread that unravels everything. The one person who loved Walt without agenda, the gentle chemist Walt allowed to be killed, reaches out from beyond his death through a line of handwriting and hands Hank the truth. There is a terrible justice in that, which the story never spells out and never needs to. But the book is doing more than springing a trap, and this is where it opens up into the deepest theme of the whole series. Because Walt Whitman is not just a convenient poet with the right initials. He is the great American poet of the self, the man who wrote a sprawling, ecstatic, decade-spanning poem called Song of Myself, who sang the individual, who celebrated the boundless, self-creating, self-expanding American soul. Whitman wrote lines about containing multitudes, about being large, about the self as something magnificent and expansive and unbounded. And that is the dark joke Breaking Bad is telling by hanging Walt's story on Whitman's book. Walter White is, in his own monstrous way, a song of myself. He is a man who set out to expand the self without limit, to contain multitudes, to become large, to celebrate and enthrone his own ego above everything else. He is the American dream of self-invention, taken to its furthest and darkest conclusion. The difference, and the show knows this difference exactly, is that Whitman's celebration of the self was generous. It reached outward. When Whitman sang himself, he was singing everyone, insisting that the celebration of one soul was the celebration of all souls, that his largeness made room for others rather than crushing them. His expansive self was an act of love for the whole democratic human family, a poet embracing the multitude and finding himself in every stranger. Walt's expansion of the self is the exact inversion. He also grows large, also refuses limits, also makes a song of himself, but his song has room for no one else in it, and every verse is paid for by someone diminished or destroyed. Whitman's self grows by loving the world. Walt's self grows by consuming it. They share initials, they share a hunger for self-creation, and they could not be further apart in what that hunger does to everyone around them. So the book becomes a kind of secret argument the series is making about America itself, about the promise of self-invention that sits at the center of the whole national mythology, the idea that a person can remake themselves into anything, can become large, can author their own soul. Whitman is that promise at its most beautiful and generous. Walt is that same promise gone rancid, the self-invention that has forgotten the world it lives in, the song of myself with the love drained out and only the myself remaining. And it is fitting, almost unbearably fitting, that the poet's book is the thing that brings Walt down, because in the end, the very idea Walt built his life on, the boundless sovereign self, is what betrays him. The multitudes he refused to make room for close in. The self he sang so loudly is heard at last by the one man who can end it. Gale's small loving gift, an ode to the American self, becomes the instrument that proves the American self, taken this far, is a kind of death. The poet gives Walt the rope, gently, fondly, with an inscription, and Walt, being who he is, cannot resist keeping it close, and it hangs him. In the middle of the third season, Breaking Bad does something almost perverse. It stops. It sets aside the drug war and the money and the mounting danger, and gives you an entire episode, called The Fly, in which essentially nothing happens except that Walt cannot catch a fly. The whole hour takes place in the underground lab, just Walt and Jesse, and Walt becomes convinced that a single housefly has gotten into the lab and will contaminate the product, and he becomes obsessed, sleepless, frantic, chasing this one insect around the room with a growing desperation that everyone around him, and eventually the audience, understands is not really about the fly at all. It is an hour that split the audience more sharply than almost any other. Some viewers finding it slow and strange, others considering it a small masterpiece, and I am firmly in the second camp, because I think it is the closest the series ever comes to letting you see directly into the sickness at the center of Walt's soul. The fly is contamination, and Walt's mania to eliminate it is the mania of a man who cannot bear the thought that his perfect product, his one pure achievement, the thing he is genuinely good at, could be tainted by something small and uncontrollable that got in from the outside. On the surface, it is about chemistry, about purity, about the 99% that makes Heisenberg's product famous. But everyone watching understands that the contamination Walt is really chasing is inside himself, that the thing that has gotten into his life and will not be caught or killed or reasoned away is guilt. is the memory of what he has done, is the knowledge that he can never again be clean. The fly is his conscience buzzing at the edge of his control, and the harder he swats at it, the more it eludes him, because you cannot kill a conscience by chasing it around a room, though God knows Walt spends the series trying. The philosophy underneath the episode is about control, and about the fantasy of purity, and about the impossibility of both. Walt's entire operation is built on the promise of control, the chemist's dream of a closed system where every variable is accounted for and every reaction proceeds exactly as designed. He is a man who believes, deeply, that with enough intelligence and enough will, he can master any situation, seal it, make it perfect, make it his. And the fly is the universe's small reply to that fantasy, the one uncontrollable thing that gets in no matter how sealed the room, the reminder that there is no closed system, that contamination is the nature of life, that you cannot build a pure kingdom in an impure world. A single fly undoes the perfect lab, and a single act of conscience, a single memory that will not stay buried, undoes the perfect self-justification Walt has constructed. He can control the chemistry, he cannot control the meaning of what he has done, and the meaning keeps buzzing. And then the episode does the thing that lifts it from clever to devastating. Deep in the sleepless night, exhausted, his defenses worn down, Walt begins to talk, drifting, half dreaming, and he comes right up to the edge of confessing the worst thing he has done. He starts talking about the night Jane died, circling it, almost saying it out loud to Jesse. Of all people, the one person who must never know. He says he has been thinking that there was a perfect moment, a right time for him to have died, a window when everything would have been better if his life had simply ended, before the worst of it, before the things he cannot take back. It is the closest Walt ever comes, in the whole series, to admitting that his life has become something he wishes he could undo, that he went too far, that there was a version of his story that could have ended in something like grace, and he blew past it. He does not quite confess. Jesse, mercifully, does not quite understand. But the mask is off. In that lab, in the small hours, and what is underneath it, is not a triumphant kingpin, but an exhausted, haunted man who suspects, in the part of himself he keeps drugged and silent, that he has damned himself, and that no amount of purity in the product will ever wash it out. That idea, of the perfect moment to have died, is one of the saddest in the whole show, and it connects to something the ancient philosophers thought hard about, the question of what makes a life good as a whole, whether a life is to be judged by its best moment or its final shape, and whether a man can outlive his own goodness. There is an old idea, going back to the Greeks, that you cannot call a life happy or good until you see how it ends, because a bad ending can retroactively poison everything that came before it. Walt, in the Fly episode, stumbles onto that terrible thought about his own life. He senses that there was a point at which his story still meant one thing, still could have been the story of a decent man who did a wrong thing for an understandable reason, and then stopped, and that he has traveled past that point into a place from which the meaning of the whole thing has changed, where even the good early years are now the prologue to a horror. The contamination has already happened. The fly is already in the room, and it got in long ago, and the frantic chase around the lab is just a man refusing to admit that the thing he most fears has already come to pass, and cannot be undone. The episode ends with the fly finally dealt with, and nothing at all resolved, because of course nothing is resolved, because the fly was never the problem. Walt goes home, and the war resumes, and the machine grinds on, and he buries the confession he almost made, back down where he keeps it. But, for 1 hour the story pulled the camera in close, and let you see the truth, that all the empire building is designed to drown out, which is that somewhere inside Walter White, there is a man who knows exactly what he has become, who lies awake haunted by it, who wishes at 3 a.m. that he had died back when he was still someone he could stand to be, and who will wake up in the daylight and put the mask back on and go do it all again. Because admitting the truth in the daylight would mean stopping, and stopping is the one full measure he will never, ever take. When the show wanted to name the episode in which Walt's entire world comes apart, it did not reach for anything from the drug trade or the language of crime. It reached back almost 200 years, to a short poem by the English Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, written in 1818, and it called the episode Ozymandias. And if you want to understand the shape of Walt's downfall, you could do a great deal worse than to simply read that sonnet, because the writers chose it with total precision, and Bryan Cranston even recited the whole poem over the images in one of the trailers that announced Breaking Bad's final run, his voice low and grave, the words landing like a sentence being passed. The poem is simple, and it is merciless. A traveler comes back from an ancient desert and describes what he found there: the ruins of an enormous statue, a shattered stone figure lying half buried in the endless sand. Two vast legs stand with no body. Nearby, sunk in the dust, is the broken face, its expression still fixed in a sneer of cold command, the arrogance of the ruler it once depicted, preserved in the stone even in ruin, and on the pedestal, words are carved. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. It is the boast of a god-king who ruled the world and built monuments to himself, and commanded the future to tremble before his greatness. And then Shelley delivers the line that the whole poem exists to deliver, the line that is the entire point. Nothing beside remains. Around that colossal wreck, the poet says, the lone and level sands stretch far away. The mightiest king who ever lived, the man who carved a command to despair into stone, is gone so completely that only a broken statue and an empty desert remain to mark that he was ever there at all. That is the philosophy of Ozymandias, and it is one of the oldest and hardest truths there is, that power is temporary, that pride builds monuments the sand always swallows, that time is patient and total and undoes every empire and every emperor without exception, that the very act of carving "Look on my works" and despair is, given a few centuries, the funniest and saddest joke in the world, because there are no works left to look on, only the desert. The Greeks called the force that brings the proud low nemesis, and Shelley's poem is nemesis rendered in stone and sand. It says to every builder of empires, however high you climb, however loudly you demand to be remembered, the sand is coming for all of it, and it will win. And the episode named after that poem is The Sand Arriving. In a single hour, everything Walt built collapses. The empire, the fortune, the family, the secret, the whole magnificent structure he spent 2 years and countless lives constructing comes down almost all at once, in the desert, on the very ground where he first began to cook. His brother-in-law dies out there in the dust, a loss we have already spoken of, and it is the moment the audience feels the ground give way completely, because up to then some part of us still half believed Walt might get away with it, might hold it together, might win. Ozymandias is the series killing that hope. The fortune he built is torn away from him, most of it seized, the rest reduced to a single barrel of cash that Walt, in one of the saddest and least forgettable images the whole series offers, rolls alone across the open desert on foot, a broken man pushing a drum of money through the same empty sands the poem describes, a king reduced to a beggar, dragging the last of his treasure across the wasteland his pride has become. The family shatters in the same hour. The truth comes out to the people it was hidden from, and the home that was the supposed reason for everything becomes a scene of violence and terror, a family turning on itself, the son finally seeing his father clearly, the whole domestic world Walt claimed to be protecting torn to pieces by his own hands, and his own choices catching up with him at last. And in the wreckage of it, Walt does two things that show you the war still raging inside him, even at the end of everything. He takes the baby, in a moment of pure madness, and then he cannot go through with it and gives her back. And then, on the phone, knowing the police are listening, he performs a final monstrous, loving act, snarling cruelty at Skyler in a rehearsed rage designed to convince the authorities that she knew nothing, that she was a terrified victim, taking all the guilt onto himself to shield her from prosecution. It is vicious, and it is tender at once, the last confused expression of a man who truly loves his family and has utterly destroyed them, and cannot tell his love and his destruction apart anymore, because in him they have become the same thing. What I find almost unbearable about the way Breaking Bad uses the Shelley poem is that it refuses to let Walt's fall be grand. Ozymandias, at least, got a colossal statue, got to be a king of kings before the sand took him, got a ruin worth writing a poem about. Walt does not even get that. His empire leaves no monument, no legacy, nothing anyone would want to remember. The blue product will be forgotten. The money is scattered or buried. His name, the name he demanded people speak, becomes a thing his own son wants erased. Where Ozymandias left a broken statue sneering across the desert, Walt leaves a man rolling a barrel through the dust, and a family that wishes he had never been born. The poem is about the vanity of even the greatest power. The episode is about something almost smaller and sadder, the vanity of a power that was never even as great as the man who wielded it believed. An empire that felt colossal from the inside, and turns out, the moment the sand shifts, to have been a very small and very temporary thing built by a very frightened man, and now nothing beside remains. It helps when you are trying to understand what kind of story Breaking Bad is telling about Walt, to notice how old the story actually is, because he has ancestors, and Breaking Bad seems to know exactly who they are. Two of them stand out, and neither is a criminal in the ordinary sense. One is Faust, the scholar of the old German legend who sold his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and power and experience, who could not bear the limits of an ordinary learned life, and traded his eternal self for a taste of the infinite. The other is Macbeth, Shakespeare's Scottish general, a good and capable man with a worm of ambition in him, who is given a glimpse of what he might become, and cannot stop himself from reaching for it, killing his way to a crown that brings him nothing but dread and blood, and finally ruin. Walt belongs to that family. He is the American, scientific, 21st century version of a very old warning. Take the Faustian side first, because it fits him almost too well. The heart of the Faust legend is not really greed for money, and critics have said the same of Walt. It is the refusal of limits, the conviction that an ordinary bounded life is a kind of insult to a man of great gifts, and the willingness to trade something sacred, the soul, for the chance to be more than a man is meant to be. Walt is a Faust who trades not with a literal devil, but with the drug world, and the thing he sells is not signed away in blood, but given up piece by piece, one killing, one lie, one crossed line at a time, until the soul is gone, and he did not notice the exact moment it left. That is the modern horror the show adds to the old legend. Faust at least knew he was making a bargain, signed the contract, understood the terms. Walt sells his soul in installments so small that at no single point does it feel like the whole thing is being sold, and by the time the account is empty he can look back and swear he never signed anything at all, that he only ever did what any reasonable man would do. The devil, in the modern version, does not need a contract. He only needs a man willing to take one more step, and then one more, each one small enough to excuse. The Macbeth side gives you the other half, the psychology of the descent, because what Shakespeare understood about Macbeth is the thing the series understands about Walt, that the first murder is agony, and each one after is easier, that a man wading into blood reaches a point where going back seems harder than going forward. There is a line in the play where Macbeth says he is so far steeped in blood that turning back would be as tedious as going on, that he might as well continue, and that is Walt precisely, the man who cannot stop, because stopping would mean facing everything he has already done, and it is easier, always easier, to take one more step deeper than to turn around and look at the road behind him. Both men are also destroyed partly by prophecy, by a vision of their own greatness that they then race to fulfill, and Walt has his prophecy too, the memory of what he was almost worth at gray matter, the ghost of the great man he might have been, driving him to prove the vision true no matter the cost. And both men end the same way, isolated, hollow, surrounded by the wreckage of everyone they used, discovering that the crown they killed for is made of nothing, that the power they bled the world to seize does not fill the hole it was supposed to fill, because the hole was never the kind of thing power can fill. What I find striking is that these are not crime stories at all. Faust is a story about knowledge and the soul. Macbeth is a story about ambition and conscience. And by placing Walt in their lineage, Breaking Bad is telling you what it thinks it is really about, which is not drugs, and not money, and not even crime, but the oldest human temptation there is, the temptation to overreach, to refuse your limits, to decide that the rules that bind other people do not bind you, because you are special, because you are gifted, because you deserve more than the small life you were handed. That temptation is not modern and it is not American, though the story dresses it in modern American clothes. It is as old as the first story anyone ever told about a person reaching for something forbidden and losing everything in the grasp. Walt is Adam and he is Faust and he is Macbeth, and he is Icarus flying at the sun, and the fact that he is also just a chemistry teacher from Albuquerque with a station wagon and a mortgage is exactly what makes the old warning land so hard, because it means the temptation did not need a devil, or a witch, or a god to arrive. It only needed a diagnosis, a grudge, and a talent, and it found in an ordinary man all the fuel it has ever needed. Step back from the individual man for a while, and look at the country he lives in, because Breaking Bad is, among everything else it is, a story about America, and specifically about the promise America makes to men like Walter White, and then quietly fails to keep. The show never lectures about this. It never has a character stand up and denounce capitalism or the American dream, but the whole thing is soaked in it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because Walt's tragedy is not only a tragedy of pride and mortality. It is the tragedy of a particular national fantasy, the belief that if you are smart enough and work hard enough, you will be rewarded, that talent finds its level, that the system is fair, and that a good man who plays by the rules will be taken care of. Walt believed that fantasy his entire life, and the series opens on the wreckage of it. Here is a man of genuine brilliance, a gifted chemist whose work, we are told, contributed to research that won a Nobel Prize, a man who by every meritocratic measure should have been rich and celebrated and secure, and instead he is teaching indifferent teenagers and wiping down cars and going bankrupt over a disease he did not cause. The system did not reward his talent. The system left him behind, and the men who did get rich, his old partners at Gray Matter, did not obviously earn it more than he did. They simply ended up on the right side of a decision Walt made out of wounded pride 20 years earlier, and they have been living the American dream ever since, while the man whose mind helped build their fortune corrects homework. The promise was a lie, or at least it was a promise the country never intended to keep for everyone, and Walt has spent 2 decades swallowing the humiliation of that broken promise while pretending to himself that he was content. So when Walt breaks bad, part of what he is doing is finally taking, by force, the reward the legitimate system denied him. And this is the deeply uncomfortable thing Breaking Bad understands, that the drug empire Walt builds is not really an escape from American capitalism. It is American capitalism, purified, stripped of its polite disguises, and run at full speed. Think about what the meth business actually is in Walt's hands. It is a startup. It is a man with a superior product and a genius for the work, seeking market share, eliminating competitors, scaling up, obsessing over quality control, expanding into new territory, building a brand so strong that his product is known by its color and his name is spoken with fear. Walt applies to crime exactly the virtues the business world claims to celebrate: innovation, excellence, ambition, the relentless drive to grow, the refusal to settle. He is, in a horrible way, the perfect entrepreneur, and the story keeps drawing the parallel so that you cannot miss it. The empire business is just the business with the mask taken off. That is the quiet indictment underneath the whole series, and it is far more subversive than any speech could be. Because if Walt is a monster, and he is, then the show is asking an uncomfortable question about the values that made him one, since those values, the worship of growth, the equation of a man's worth with his success, the belief that winning justifies almost anything, the contempt for whoever settles for enough, are not values Walt invented in the desert. They are the values he absorbed from the culture around him, the same culture that told him his talent should have made him rich and then punished him for believing it. Walt's phrase, the empire business, is chilling partly because it is honest in a way ordinary business language never is. Most empire builders call it something nicer. Walt just says the true word, and the true word reveals that the appetite driving the drug lord and the appetite driving the admired titan of industry might be, at bottom, the same appetite, differing in legality but not in kind. The American dream also carries a darker cargo that the series puts its finger on, which is the idea that a man's dignity and his manhood are measured by his ability to provide, to win, to be the successful head of a household, and that a man who cannot do those things has failed at being a man at all. Walt is crushed by this belief long before the cancer. Every day he is not the provider he thinks he should be. Every day he takes charity or accepts a lesser position or watches his wife worry about money. He experiences it as a wound to his very manhood, an emasculation. The dream did not just promise him wealth. It told him that without the wealth, he was not fully a man, and that lie is at least as destructive as the broken promise of reward, because it means that when Walt finally starts making enormous amounts of money through crime, he does not just feel rich. He feels, for the first time in decades, like a man. The money is not money. It is masculinity. It is dignity. It is the self-respect the legitimate world denied him, converted into cash and stacked in a storage unit, and that is why no amount is ever enough, because you cannot fill a wounded sense of manhood with dollars, though the entire culture keeps insisting that you can. So Breaking Bad leaves you with a deeply disturbing thought, which is that Walter White is not an aberration from the American story, but a logical product of it. The American dream followed all the way to its shadow. He wanted what he was told to want, worth measured in success, manhood measured in provision, dignity measured in the size of the empire, and when the honest roads to those things were closed to him, he took the dishonest one, and the values pushing him down that road were the values his country taught him to hold. That does not excuse a single thing he did. But it does complicate the comfortable idea that Walt is simply a bad apple, a monster we can hold at a safe distance. The story keeps whispering that the seeds of Heisenberg are planted in things a great many perfectly ordinary people believe, and that is a far more unsettling proposition than a story about one evil man could ever be. There is an argument that fans of the show have been having with each other since it ended, and it is really a very old philosophical argument wearing a new costume, so it is worth laying out plainly. The question is this: did Walter White become Heisenberg, or was he always Heisenberg, waiting? Was the monster created by cancer and circumstance and bad luck, a good man deformed by unbearable pressure, or was the monster there the whole time, dormant inside the mild teacher, needing only an excuse and an opportunity to step into the light? It sounds like a question about a fictional character, but underneath it is the oldest question in moral philosophy, the question of free will and determinism, of whether we are the authors of who we become, or merely the places where forces beyond our control play themselves out. The determinist reading is seductive, and the series flirts with it constantly. On this view, everything Walt does follows inevitably from what he already was. Given his particular wound, the old humiliation of gray matter, given his particular pride, given his particular intelligence, and his particular circumstances, the diagnosis was always going to produce exactly this, and there was never really a moment where he could have chosen differently, because the man doing the choosing was already the man who would choose this. Every step on the determinist reading is the necessary consequence of the step before, a chain of cause and effect running from a proud young man walking away from a company all the way to an old man dying on a warehouse floor, with no genuine fork anywhere along the line, only the appearance of choice masking an underlying inevitability. It is a bleak reading, and it has real support in the series, because Breaking Bad does feel, especially on a rewatch, like a machine grinding toward a predetermined end, like a tragedy in the strict Greek sense, where the outcome is fixed from the first scene, and the only suspense is in watching it arrive. But I do not think the story finally believes the determinist reading, and the reason is the exit ramps. If Walt's descent were truly inevitable, the writers would not have worked so hard, again and again, to place in front of him clear opportunities to stop, opportunities where a different choice was genuinely available and would truly have saved him. Remember how many there were. The charity from his old partners offered early, which would have paid for everything. The chance to take his money and walk away offered more than once. The pile of cash already large enough to secure his family several times over. The pleading of his wife. The warnings of Mike, who told him plainly to get out while he could. At every one of these moments, the show is careful to make the alternative real, to show you that Walt could have done otherwise, that the door was open and standing wide and he chose not to walk through it. A determinist tragedy does not need to keep showing you open doors. The fact that Breaking Bad shows you so many, and lingers on each one, is the series insisting on Walt's freedom, insisting that this was chosen, that at every fork he took the darker road, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The philosophers who defend free will against determinism often focus on exactly this, the sense that moral responsibility requires that a person could have done otherwise, that we only rightly praise or blame someone for an act if a real alternative was open to them and they chose as they did. And Breaking Bad is, in the end, a story about moral responsibility, which means it has to be a story about freedom, because you cannot hold a machine responsible, you can only hold a chooser responsible. Breaking Bad wants Walt to be responsible. It wants his damnation to be earned, not merely suffered. And so it builds the exit ramps, dozens of them, precisely so that no viewer can finally say he had no choice, so that the verdict lands on a free man and not on a helpless victim of forces beyond his control. So how do we answer the fans' question, became or always was? I think the honest answer, and the one the story seems to hold, is a kind of both, and it maps onto a middle position in the philosophy that thinkers call compatibilism, the idea that freedom and a kind of determinism can coexist, that our choices really flow from our own character and desires, and are therefore truly ours and truly free, even though that character was itself shaped by things we did not choose. Walt's capacity for Heisenberg was always in him. The pride, the resentment, the hunger, the ability to be cold, all of it predates the cancer. All of it was formed by a life and a temperament he did not select. In that sense, the potential was always there, and the determinists are half right. But potential is not destiny, and the actualizing of that potential, the turning of the capacity into the deed, happened through thousands of real choices at real forks, and those choices were his, freely made, which is why he is guilty and not merely unlucky. He was always capable of becoming Heisenberg. He was never compelled to. The seed was always in the soil. He is the one who watered it, every day, at every chance to let it die instead, and that daily watering, done freely when he could have stopped, is the whole difference between a tragedy of fate and a tragedy of character, and Breaking Bad is emphatically the second kind. That is why the finale matters so much, and why the show could not end without letting Walt say the true thing at last, because a story this committed to human freedom and human responsibility has to arrive, finally, at the moment where the free man stops lying and takes ownership of what he freely chose. And that moment is where we are headed now, to the very end, to the confession that reframes everything. Before we reach the last hour, there is one more thread to pull, and it is the one the whole story hangs from, because everything in Breaking Bad begins with a man being told he is going to die. The cancer is not just the plot device that sets Walt cooking, it is the philosophical ground the entire series stands on, the confrontation with mortality that forces the oldest question a human being can ask, which is what, if anything, a life means when you know for certain it is going to end, and end soon. The French writer Albert Camus spent his career on a version of this question, and he gave it a name, the absurd, by which he meant the collision between our deep human hunger for meaning and purpose and a universe that offers us none, that simply is, indifferent, silent, and finite. We long for our lives to matter, to add up to something, to have a point, and we are set down in a world that makes us no such promise, and hands each of us, in the end, only death. Camus thought this was the fundamental human situation, and that the great question was how to live in the face of it, without either lying to ourselves with false comforts or giving up in despair. His most famous image is the ancient figure of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for all eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time, forever, a life of pure, pointless repetition. And Camus' startling conclusion was that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, that a person can find meaning not in the promise of some final reward, but in the lived intensity of the struggle itself, in fully inhabiting their fate rather than fleeing it. Walter White is a man handed the absurd in its rawest form. He is told the exact shape of his death, given a number, less than 2 years, and the diagnosis strips away every comfortable illusion he had been using to avoid the question of what his life was for. And here is what is so awful and so fascinating about his response. Walt discovers his own version of Camus' answer, and he gets it catastrophically, revealingly wrong. Faced with the meaninglessness of a life that had disappointed him, and a death that would soon erase him, Walt goes looking for intensity, for the feeling of being fully alive, for a struggle he can throw himself into completely, and he finds it in the one place it should never be found. He finds that cooking meth and building an empire and outwitting killers and being feared makes him feel more alive than anything in his long, safe, disappointing, legitimate life ever did. The cancer, by threatening to end him, paradoxically wakes him up, and the waking feels so good, so vivid, so intensely real after decades of numbness, that he mistakes the intensity for meaning, mistakes feeling alive for living well. That is the trap the series lays bare, and it is a deeply profound one, because feeling alive and living a good life are not the same thing, and a great deal of human misery comes from confusing them. Walt is not wrong that his crime makes him feel alive. He is telling the truth about that, right to the end. The danger, the mastery, the stakes, the sense of being at last the author of his own story, rather than its victim, all of it floods a man who had been sleepwalking with a vividness he had forgotten was possible, and you can understand, you can even envy, the aliveness of it. But Breaking Bad insists, gently and then brutally, that intensity is not meaning, that a life can be full of adrenaline and consequence, and the thrill of mattering, and still be, on the whole, a catastrophe, a waste, a thing that leaves the world worse, and everyone in it diminished. Camus' Sisyphus finds meaning in a struggle that harms no one, in the pure private confrontation with his own absurd fate. Walt finds his intensity in a struggle that feeds on other people, and so the very thing that makes him feel alive is the thing that kills everyone around him, and the aliveness is real, but it is bought with a currency of other lives, and no amount of feeling can make that a life well lived. And there is a bitter irony in the timing that the story never stops pressing on, which is that the whole saga takes place inside the space of the death sentence. Walt is given roughly 2 years, and the crime spree lasts roughly 2 years, and he dies at the end of it at around the age of 52, essentially at the far edge of the window the doctors first named. The cancer bookends the crime. The two clocks, the clock of the disease and the clock of the empire, run side by side and stop together. And that overlap means something. It means that Walt's entire second life, the Heisenberg life, the alive life, fits precisely inside the borrowed time the cancer gave him. That everything he built and destroyed happened in the shadow of a death he could see coming the whole way. He spent his allotted dying time not making peace, not repairing what he could, not being with the people he loved in the way a dying man might, but building a monument to his own significance that collapsed before he did. Given 2 years to figure out what a life is for, he chose to spend them proving he could be enormous, and the proof cost him everything the enormity was supposedly protecting. So when we finally arrive at the confession, at the moment Walt says the truest words he ever says, we should hear them against all of this, against Camus and the absurd, and the two clocks running down together. Because the confession is Walt at last admitting what his whole response to mortality really was, admitting that the intensity was the point, that feeling alive was the thing he was chasing all along, and the horror and the honesty of it land so hard precisely because we have watched, for 2 years and 5 seasons, exactly what that chase cost. And so we come to the end, to the finale, which the show called Felina, a title that is a small puzzle in itself, an anagram of the word finale, and also, some have noticed, a stringing together of chemical symbols, iron and lithium and sodium, and also the name of a woman in an old Marty Robbins song about a man who rides back into a town where death is waiting for him because he cannot stay away from the thing he loves. All three meanings are true at once, which is exactly the kind of layered, careful thing this show does, and all three point at the same fact, that Walt is riding back to where it began, to die on purpose, to finish it, to put things in whatever order a man like him can still put them. The last episode is, on the surface, a kind of wish fulfillment, and Breaking Bad plays that knowingly, doing something sly by giving it to us. Walt gets to tie up nearly every loose end. He frightens his old partners at Grey Matter into agreeing to pass his remaining money to his son, disguised as a charitable gift, so that the family will finally get the fortune in a form they will actually accept. He deals with Lydia, the nervous businesswoman who would have kept the poison flowing, doing it quietly and from a distance with the ricin that has waited all series for its final use, dropped into the chamomile tea she takes with the artificial sweetener she never varies. And then he goes to the compound of Jack Welker and his gang, the men who stole his money and killed his brother-in-law and enslaved Jesse, and he brings with him a machine, a motorized gun mounted in the trunk of his car, rigged to fire on its own, and he triggers it, and it tears through the room and kills nearly all of them at once. It is, structurally, a revenge fantasy, the wronged man returning to destroy those who wronged him, and part of you, watching, wants it, which is the series implicating you one last time, letting you cheer for Heisenberg's competence even now, even here. But look closer at how Breaking Bad stages it, because it refuses, at every turn, to let the ending be clean or triumphant. Walt is not untouched. As the gun fires, he throws himself over Jesse to shield him, and in doing so he is struck, hit in the abdomen by a round from his own machine, a ricochet from the very weapon he built. That detail is not an accident. The story could have let him walk away unharmed and die later of the cancer. Instead, it makes sure that the instrument of his final act of power is also the instrument of his death, that the machine he built to impose his will one last time turns and wounds him mortally in the same breath. He dies by his own device. The empire builder is killed by his own empire, in miniature, one last time, and the poetry of it is deliberate and merciless. And then there is Jesse. Walt frees him from the chains the gang had kept him in, and holds out to him, in effect, the chance to end it, to shoot the man who ruined his life. And Jesse, as we spoke of before, refuses, throws the weapon down, will not become the thing Walt became, and drives away into the dark, alive and free. Walt does not die at Jesse's hand, and he does not die a martyr's clean death, and he does not die by his own deliberate suicide either, which is why the honest way to describe his end is that he is mortally wounded by a stray round from his own trap, and slowly bleeds out in the minutes that follow. It is not a noble death, and it is not a punished death handed down by a court, and it is not a peaceful one. It is something stranger and more fitting, a man dying by the logic of the thing he made, neither executed nor redeemed, simply ending where and how his choices always pointed. But the true climax of Felina is not the gun. It is a conversation, quiet and small, in a kitchen, between Walt and Skyler, and it is the moment the entire series has been building toward for 5 seasons. Skyler is broken, hunted, ruined, and Walt comes to say goodbye, and she has heard the excuse 10,000 times, that he did it for the family, and she cannot bear to hear it one more time, and she tells him so. And Walt, for the first and only time, does not say it. He stops. And instead he tells her the truth. He says he did it for himself. He says he liked it, he says he was good at it, and he says, and his voice breaks a little on the words, that he was alive. I did it for me. I liked it, I was good at it, and I was alive. That is the whole show in 4 sentences, and it is the reason the ending works, and I would argue it is as important a piece of dialogue as modern television has produced, because it is the moment the bad faith finally shatters, the moment the anesthetic wears off and the man looks directly at the truth he spent 2 years drugging himself against. For 5 seasons he told everyone, including himself, that his crimes were a sacrifice made out of love. And here, at the end, with nothing left to protect and no one left to fool, he admits that the love was a cover story, that the real engine was his own hunger, his own pleasure, his own need to feel enormous and competent and awake. It is not an apology. It is something rarer and harder, an honest self-accounting, a man finally telling the truth about his own soul, and the show gives it to Skyler, the person he lied to most, because she is the one owed the truth most. Notice what the series does not give him. It does not give him forgiveness, not really. Skyler softens slightly, because at last he has stopped lying to her, and there is a small grace in being told the truth even by a monster, but she does not absolve him, and Breaking Bad does not absolve him. It does not give him his family back. His son wants nothing to do with him. It does not give him his empire, which is gone, or his fortune, most of which is scattered, or his good name, which is destroyed. It does not even give him a heroic death. What it gives him is exactly one thing: honesty, the truth at last, and then it lets him die. And where it lets him die is the final, perfect statement, because Walt does not die at home, or with his family, or anywhere that would suggest the domestic life he claimed to be fighting for. He staggers, bleeding, into the meth lab, the place of his real love, the place where he felt most alive, and he wanders among the gleaming equipment, running his hand along the steel with something like tenderness, and he collapses there and dies on the floor of the laboratory, with a faint smile on his face, surrounded not by the people he said he did it for, but by the instruments of the thing he actually did it for. That final image is Breaking Bad's whole verdict, delivered without a single word. A man who spent his last 2 years insisting he was sacrificing everything for his family dies alone, smiling, in a drug lab, in love with his machines, and it is exactly right, exactly honest, exactly where he belonged. The consequentialist arithmetic that was supposed to justify it all has collapsed completely. He set out to secure his family, and he has lost his family. He set out to leave a fortune, and he has left almost nothing they will take. He set out to become someone, and he became something his own son wishes had never existed. Every column of the ledger he trusted has come out the opposite of what he calculated, and the story, which withheld its judgment for so long, delivers it in the end with total clarity. It does not let him off the hook. It never redeems him. It grants him only the dignity of the truth and the fittingness of the place he chose to die, and it leaves you to understand that Walt's whole philosophy, the magnificent, seductive, brilliantly reasoned structure of it, ends here, on a concrete floor, with a smile, alone. There is one last thing to say about the philosophy of Walter White, and it is the thing that makes the show more than a clever morality play, more than a well-built tragedy, and it is this. Breaking Bad does not only put Walt on trial, it puts you on trial, the person watching, and it does it so gently that most people never notice they have been convicted along with him. Because here is the uncomfortable fact about how this show is experienced. For a very long time, most viewers root for Walt. They want him to escape, to win the deal, to outsmart the DEA, to build the empire. They feel the thrill of that same line in their own chest. They cheer when he says his name in the desert. And the series engineers all of that on purpose, seduces you deliberately into the passenger seat of a monster's becoming, and lets you enjoy the ride, and only slowly, so slowly you cannot name the exact moment it happened, does it turn the lights on and let you see who you have been cheering for, and what you have been cheering. That is the deepest and cleverest thing the series does with its philosophy, because it does not let you stand safely outside the story, pronouncing judgment on a bad man. It implicates you. It shows you that the same hungers driving Walt, the desire to matter, the fear of being small, the intoxication of power, the flattering story we tell ourselves about our own motives, live in you too, or Breaking Bad could never have gotten you to root for him in the first place. You rooted for Walt because some part of you understood him, because his wound is a common wound, and his fantasy is a common fantasy, and his self-justifications are the exact self-justifications ordinary people use every day on a smaller scale. The story does not say Walt is a monster, and you are not. It says Walt is a monster, and shows you precisely how a decent person becomes one reasonable choice at a time, and by the way, you enjoyed watching, did you not? And that quiet accusation, delivered without a word, is why the show stays with people for years after they finish it, itching at something they cannot quite settle. What finally makes Walter White one of the great characters in the history of the medium is that he is not a villain you can hold at arm's length, and he is not a hero you can admire cleanly. He is a mirror, angled just so, and what it shows is the terrible plasticity of a human being, the way a person really can author themselves into almost anything, for good or for ruin, and the way the story we tell ourselves about why we do what we do is so often the last thing we are willing to look at honestly. He spent 2 years and everything he had chasing the feeling of being alive, and he found it, and it killed everyone it touched, and at the very end, bleeding out among his beloved machines, he told the truth for once, and the truth was the simplest and saddest thing imaginable. He did it for himself. He liked it. And for a little while, in the worst possible way, he was alive. That is where we will leave him, on the floor of that lab, the school teacher and the kingpin, and the dying man, all finally the same person, the uncertainty resolved at last into a single quiet body, the study of change come to its end. Breaking Bad remains, more than a decade after it finished, one of the few television stories that people reach for when they want to argue about good and evil, and freedom, and pride, and what a life is for, and it earned that place not by lecturing anyone, but by building, patiently, and without mercy, the fullest portrait of a soul destroying itself that the medium has produced, and then handing you a mirror and asking, without ever raising its voice, whether you are quite as sure as you thought you were that you would have done differently. It is a hard, beautiful, unforgiving piece of work, and it does not offer comfort, only clarity, and sometimes, late at night, clarity is the thing worth staying up for. So if you have made it this far with me, thank you for sitting through the whole descent, through the pride and the poison and the empire and the desert and the small honest words at the very end. Let your eyes close if they have not already. Let the questions settle without needing to answer them tonight. There is no verdict you have to reach before you sleep. There is only a dying man in a lab with a faint smile, and the long level sand stretching away, and the quiet fact that the story, unlike the man, will still be here in the morning. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.